Welcome to another artist conversation in our series, Pathways for Dialogue, Past, Present, Future.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm really glad to be here and to see all of you tonight. I want to give a special thank you to Claudia. There's Claudia for inviting me. Thank you very much. And to Jim Petrucci, of course, of the Petrucci Foundation for providing these kinds of experiences for us, and to Lisa Lees for producing tonight and for that nice introduction. Thank you. So I'm happy to be moderating and talking to these two artists tonight and hearing a little bit more about their work that they will be able to share with you. And we'll talk about, as we see, we'll talk about how their work maybe relates to each other, but really takes its own lives in and of themselves. To my immediate left is Claes Gabriel. Claes's piece, and I hope you've had a chance to look around a little bit. Claes's piece is when you first come in the gallery and swing a right, the Queen of Time is on its own wall. It's a stretched and painted canvas, painted in the form of an abstracted mask. And Claes is a Philadelphia-based artist from Port-au-Prince, Haiti. After moving to the United States as a child, Claes settled in Baltimore and later earned his BFA at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and then did some graduate work at Temple University's Tyler School of Art. He's exhibited his work in Port-au-Prince, in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New York, and Paris. In addition to his work being on the Petrucci Family Foundation collection, it's also in the permanent collection of the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, and has been shown at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, and is in many private collections across the country. LeRone, two seats down from me, you saw his work when you first entered the exhibition, the round silver reflective piece. We'll talk about how we would describe that. That set the tone for the exhibition. So right when you walk in, you see LeRone Wilson's work. LeRone is based here in New York and is represented by Bill Hodges Gallery. He received his BFA from the University of Illinois at Chicago and has shown his work in numerous museums across the country, including the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, the Museum of Biblical Art, and the African American Museum in Dallas. Special honors include being a finalist for the Lewis Comfort Tiffany Award and winner of the Best in Show for the Carol Harris Sims Award. LeRone also won the 2011 Bombay Sapphire Artisan Award given during Art Basel Miami Week, where he was competing with 4,000 artists across the country. So please join me in welcoming these two very accomplished artists.
Thank you.
To get us started, I wanted to start with a question that dealt with the visual properties of your work, because we have, as we know, we have one piece by each of these artists in the collection. But the people in the audience might not know what the rest of your work looks like. So I want to get started talking about the visuals so that we can kind of contextualize what your work looks like for those who might not know as much about it. The first question I wanted to ask was about your creative process, because when you look at your work, one piece of each of your work, they have similarities, not necessarily, meaningful ones or similarities about content, but in terms of the visual properties, they both have a couple of things in common. One is that they hover somewhere between two-dimensional painting and three-dimensional sculpture. And another is the tactility, the textural quality of them. They're very highly textured, where you've used your medium to build up the surface into something very substantial, very physically present. So I wonder if each of you might talk a little bit about your process to get us started and talk about how you actually work with your mediums, with your hands, and what the result is. Is it painting? Is it sculpture? Is it something different from that?
I'll go first. Well, just to start in reference to the process and what I'm doing, I actually melt wax. Powder pigment is the color. resin is a bond, propolis is a sustainment, and carnauba, which makes wax even harder. And at times, depending on the color scheme of what I'm using in that particular piece, I add pollen and honey. And you know, so it's 7 different sort of aspects that I incorporate into one solvent, which is the most important thing. And you know, I'm actually painting out of a hot skillet, and it's only 12 by 12 inches. So you know, it's really a technical process in terms of what I'm creating and trying to fuse one solvent into one, so I can incorporate that from the pot to the actual panel. And then, you know, I always looked at my work as a sculptural process, and within that, it was more of me understanding how to mix these pigments and burn them in beeswax, which is a very ancient technique that came from a period in Kemet. And the same way that they were creating wax and fusing it on the walls in Nanta Playa is the same way that I'm doing right now. And you know, what I was trying to sort of master into what my technique was first learning how to understand pigment and using it in wax with heat. And that's the most prominent sort of aspect and discipline that you have to have with using that medium, because, you know, I'm burning it. And then I'm mixing all of these solvents as one in order to create that word to fuse. And that's one of the most important properties in terms of what my work has to be sustained by. It has to fuse itself, because I'm using all these different elements in it. And you know, that was really the process and how I mastered what to do in terms of learning about the wax and burning at certain temperatures, because certain pigments can't burn at high temperatures. And if it does, it'll break down the wax, it'll break down the whole chemical process of how I'm using it in the pot. And basically, that's what I have to, you know, pay attention to in the beginning of that.
So when you're working with this substance that's in the pot, how do you then get it onto a surface?
So from the pot, I actually created knives they're palette knives, and they have certain teeth to them. So when I'm scooping it out the pot, once it fuses, I'm applying it to the panel of what I'm painting on. And then that buildup is a layering process over several weeks, several months. And you know, depending on the depth of where I want to create in terms of certain textures and movement of the wax for you to see visually, I just literally have to be patient, because every time I per se use that amount of pigment or wax in that pot to just get a layer on the surface of it, I have to repeat that several times. So it's just like I have to pay attention to how it fuses and burns, so I can manipulate it to be applied to the surface. And it takes time, but you know, it's no problem with me scooping it out the pot. It's just that, you know, me layering it to a surface that I want to have and achieve and make it look from the pot to the panel.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I heard you use the word paint, but then you were also talking about palette knives, and I know that you use all sorts of tools.
Well, it's a powder pigment.
Oh, okay.
That's the only way that I can actually get a color to mix with the wax. I can't use typical, you know, paints that oils, acrylics, pastels, they won't burn in beeswax.
Yeah, so it has to be able to they have to work together.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
So yeah, that's pretty much the process, but applying it from the pot to the panel is an easy process. It was just that I have to kind of understand, if the wax is not really working the way it fuses itself correctly, it makes me start over. It literally makes me start over. So it's like, it's talking to me to say, well, if you're gonna mix these solvents together, you have to let it fuse correctly in order to get that buildup and can get the texture that I'm trying to create within the pot to the panel.
Yeah, and it's very time consuming. Like you have to wait for it to dry or harden.
Because it dries immediately. As soon as I put it on the panel, it dries. So it's just like I said, it's a layering process that takes quite a few hours of patience and discipline to understand. Not every pigment is going to burn the same way. They're all different plants. So in order to master that, I have to pay attention to what the pot is telling me before I even apply it to the actual panel.
Yeah, yeah. Well, your process is also very involved in.
I think it's so similar. It's amazing how we reach different results with a very similar process. I'm glad you went first. Just like no, I mean, just like your piece sets the tone. Like, I'm so glad you went first because there are a couple of things you said that really jumped at me. The idea that you make knives, the fact that when you're so in love with the process, you really have to start making your own tools, like shaping your brushes to get them to do exactly what you want. And then you fall in love with finding out what the paint, what the canvas, what the materials can or cannot do. And by falling in love with the material, and there's another thing you said that I would love, listening to the material. I think it can take you a long place. Mm-hmm. My process, to be honest, there's this guy named Art Benson at Micah, like 25, 30 years ago. I think he lived on a boat and the boat burned. So back then people had slides, so he lost his entire body of work. Oh, wow. You know, it's not like it was backed up somewhere. Yeah. And I remember he handled it quite well. And I was a senior at the time, and he's like, Clay, you're gonna get out of here, and you're gonna leave with the same luggage that you came in here, full of skills, but nothing new. I want you to take this piece of wood, and everyone's gonna cut it, glue it, but I want you to make it like elastic, stretch it, do what you're not supposed to do with it. Mm-hmm. I was like, this guy's off his rockers. What is he doing? Is it because he's tough? But that stuck with me. So I guess for me, my process was taking a few years trying to make wood do what it's not supposed to do. Mm-hmm. Okay. By really falling in love with the materials themselves. So my father was a painter. I always saw myself as a painter, and the idea of a painting to me started with stretching the canvas around the stretchers. Like back in the days, not everyone, today everyone just goes to an art store and buy a pre-stretched canvas, not realizing the steps that it takes for the canvas to get to that point. And you are eliminating so much. You're literally eliminating Sam Gilliam, Frank Stella, Ellsworth Kelly. You're saying that history, who cares? Let me just reinvent. Like, we are totally forfeiting that. So even at an early age, I fell in love with the process of making my own stretchers. What does that take? Learning how to use a power tool, maybe learning how to use a T-square. And obviously that got boring, just like Frank Stella, Ellsworth Kelly, those guys started breaking out of the square. So the Queen of Time is an accumulation of doing that to the point where I've created a structure out of wood, stretched canvas around it, sewed the canvas, gessoed the canvas, and then listened to it to figure out what and where to paint on it. Okay. Yeah, so your stretchers in a piece in your shaped canvases, they're not like stretchers for two-dimensional works. They're built. They're built and tilted at an angle so that if and when I stretch canvas on it, it would be more like a drum. Because when you look at a stretcher, it's full square pieces of wood that when you stretch canvas around it, it creates a square or a rectangle. Mm-hmm. So why not just play around with that concept? All I have to do is figure out how to make a structure and figure out what will make canvas appear to have volume. So it sounds like when you're coming from the thought process of a painter, but you're working into 3 dimensions now, do you think you've crossed that bridge into sculpture? I think it's by giving ourselves limitations. I give myself limitations by saying, I'm a painter. Gosh darn it, I'm a painter. Okay. That's it. So it's always going to be wood, canvas, paint. Mm-hmm. I can push it wherever I want now. Yeah. I'm kind of opposite. But my training, I was creating paintings. I was doing abstract paintings, and I'm continuing to do that. But my studies in metal, where I'm really at, that's my love. Is the metal part of composition, of sculpturing, and I tried to put the two together. And fortunately, it's actually worked in terms of me sculpturally creating that in my work to make the wax look like metal. Okay. And that process was just a little bit of me changing the dynamics of how you're supposed to look at my work, because it's very three-dimensional and this texture and the relief of it, which is very sculptural. Mm-hmm. But the painting aspect, I hate it because
it had to make me disciplined in terms of being patient. And it challenged me with this material because after I would have to let the wax tell me what to do, and the final result, it was the best thing I ever made. And it just kept me going in terms of how I wanted to create my work to look very sculptural, and just the process and just this technique of something unique that you typically don't see that's very ancient.
Right.
And that was the challenge. And it's just, I see that within all of my work now because it's so dynamic of how I just see color like in the light of like people playing music. And that color can give me different textures in terms of how to pay attention to the bee and what flowers they like to go pollinate. So bamboo is one of the best pollinator plants that they like that looks like this color. That's literally why I wore this shirt today. So, you know, that just made me understand more to process how the bees work and looking for what texture they like to use to come back to the hive.
Okay, yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, because you're
So
working.
I kind of flipped it in that process, even with the process of just working with the wax itself.
Right. Well, that's an interesting path that you're taking because you're working with this beeswax, right?
Yes.
And then you're thinking you're kind of keeping going with that in terms of how a bee, responds to color.
Right.
And I think color is something that is very different in your work. You seem to use color very differently. You've got the silvery tones. You're using what might appear, right, at first glance as a single color. It isn't.
It isn't.
And a lot of your work kind of looks like it might, be in one narrow color range or, not necessarily involve lots. That's not necessarily the case, right?
Right.
But Claes, you use a lot of electric colors. I see a lot of primaries in your work, blacks and whites and strong primaries. You're using a lot of electric colors that have lots of contrast layered on top of each other. And it's, and working with the kind of power of color to reflect in your work on a white background. And I think color, it seems to me very different, but I'm wondering if there's a lot more similarities between the two of you.
I think it is.
I mean, I think the use of monochromatic color
Yes.
is a sign of maturity, and I hope to reach that at some point. I think what I'm doing is an inability to make a decision. And you know what I mean? So I just throw them all in there and hope it works out. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. But I've done like maybe 6 monochromatic paintings, and they're my favorite pieces. It's a sign of self-control, maturity, and all that. Can you imagine if I could do all those dots like 2 colors, back and forth, back and forth? Of course not, because I would get bored or distracted. So a lot of people think I have a system for my colors. I don't. It may just be like the car that I saw because the cars have amazing colors, or just picking colors. I just think my brain has a way of like cataloging it and said, I'll use that later.
Yeah.
And it just comes out later.
Yeah.
But there's no system to it for me.
Can you tell everybody how the shaped canvases work when you have color on the back that you can't see?
When you would go to see these 1980s artists use, what was that, neon lights? I really hated how you could see the light coming down the gallery wall and you could see how the light appeared. So I feel like as a painting, we're magicians, right? It's like you don't want to show how you do things. So it took me a minute, but I was working with this artist, Alonzo Davis, as his studio assistant, and he's a bamboo artist, and he would paint these bright neon colors on the back of his pieces so that they would have a little glow on the wall. So I played with green, I played with red, but over the years I realized that orange really glows the brightest if the wall is white and it's lit okay. And it really makes it feel like the piece is a bug, like something from another dimension. Because one, you can't see the wire of the neon light, you don't see anything. And it's really subtle too.
Yeah.
It changes throughout the day, it depends on if the sun is beaming on it. I live with these pieces and it's kind of rewarding to see the beam sometimes.
Yeah, because in the more, like we'll see, and I hope that you do notice when you go around the gallery again to look at the wall, and see how that space is engaged. But I'm sure it does change. Morning light, evening light, gallery light would all kind of bring a new dimension visually to the piece.
I just want to, it's interesting how he said he couldn't use 2 colors. And by me using one color,
That's why I said it's maturity.
Thank you for saying that, but it's just interesting how I'm just the opposite, because when I was in school, in undergraduate school, it was just so much color going around with, you know, artists creating their portraits or, you know, whatever it was. And I just was just like, I just said to myself, wait a minute, I got to slow down, because I'm really in tune with color, but I got to challenge myself as a sculptor to paint with one color and make substance to it. Mm-hmm. And that was really a profound sort of challenge for me in the light of where I was being taught. And the teaching of these other professors at the time, they were very abstract in how they were making their work. And I just said, it was sort of like a stereotype that I needed or showcase my work as an African-American artist. And I wasn't focused on that. I wanted to learn abstraction. And I wanted to know and understand minimalism and very monochromatic ways of trying to sculpt things in one material. So I just challenged myself to kind of do that with metal, but I was paying attention to how metal moves and works within fire and heat. So I just said, I'm gonna stick with it, and literally the wax came into play, and then I just kind of just stayed with it. And now, you know, it's hard to find, even now in the mainstream art, the contemporary art world, to see sculptors or any painters painting now with one color, and then it be sculptural. Right. So, you know, I wanted to master that kind of process and incorporate that into what I'm doing, because, especially with this material, because it's very time consuming, and that was a challenge in a way itself too. But I said, I can do this, and then now it's been 3 decades. So, you know, that understanding and technique is really profound in my spirituality and the process and, you know, the whole dynamics of how you're supposed to look at my work.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, you mentioned, you're talking about one color versus, you know, lots of different colors, but when you were talking to me earlier, you were talking about all the different colors that you're using to get that silver, that it's not just, you know, it's all these different pigments.
Well, I was mentioning that first because the metal aspect of looking at metal is bronze, brass, gold, copper, and then there's silver, pewter, iridescent, silver. So that particular piece has 3 of those colors in there to kind of give it a dimension of you seeing just not one technical color. And the collection of work that I was focusing on those particular metallics, you know, it's good to see all 4 of those silvers. You know what I mean? Although it's kind of subtle in how you can look in there. I think if I hadn't really didn't mention it, people would think that's the same color. But, you know, it's still, when you translate those 4 colors together, they're supposed to be in that contrast and in that aesthetic of that piece, because I've done several pieces in that light of colors, and they all can be seen as one.
Oh, okay, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like, you know, you're seeing figurative work, but I'm doing 4 colors in that figurative color.
Yeah, yeah, and then that makes that, you know, the depth of that color,
right.
You know, it makes it really kind of much more complex than a flat.
Exactly.
Use of one flat color. Well, you know, both of you in your responses mentioned either artists or movements from the past, and as an art historian, I'm kind of, you know, have the training to always be mindful of that which came before. And I'm wondering, you know, Claes, in some of your works, you're very upfront, you're very clear about thinking about other artists and having a relationship to other artists, like either in your titles where you might, you know, name an artist, Albers, for example, or whether, you know, you are making visual references to other artists. And I wonder if you could each talk about, or actually, I have a different kind of question that I'll put to you in a second, but I know that since you're kind of looking at specific artists and thinking about them, how you actually work with those art historical precedents, but also how you diverge from them.
How do I work with the artists that I'm inspired by, you saying?
Yeah.
So I try to copy them to begin with, you know, to study their style, and then after that, jump off with what I got from it. So when I was at MICA, I learned a lot about the white artists from the 60s that really influenced me, and then I spent some time at Howard and learned a lot about Harlem Renaissance artists, and they had a huge impact on me. William H. Johnson, Jacob Lawrence, You know, William H. Johnson is one of my favorite artists. Like, the narrative in his work, each painting seems to tell stories. But I also like, you know, a lot of Gustav Klimt, a lot of anyone who was breaking out of the shape. I like Frank Stella to begin with, but I like narrative artists, and I have my own narrative of Haiti that I try to put under surface, and that's very different on my flat paintings, and that's usually, so I look at my flat paintings as inspiration for my shape canvases. The shape canvases don't really need anything, because they kind of start with the construction of the shape. After that, it's just like going downhill. You can't really say, oh, I'm going to make this painting about Jacob Lawrence. It doesn't work out that way with the shape canvases. It's more like you have a kid and you live with the kid for a few years and then you name the kid. Because that's the vibe the kid is giving.
Right.
Like Native Americans used to do. Or they might name him because he was born in November or something. You know what I mean? The shape canvases are more like telling me what to do.
Yeah.
So they're two different processes, and the shape canvases are more like reaching back to ancestry, tribal culture that's deep within. My flat work, I'm using my mind to study art history to see where, as a black man, I might fit in that conversation. But I know you had mentioned about the spirituality of my work, but the shape canvases are completely different approach, and it's a completely different finished process. Like that Albert's piece with reclining nude, I did it because I worked at museums as an art handler. I love modern art. I think it was inspired from an Egon Schiele drawing. I just saw it and I just was in love with the drawing, and I wanted to do my own black version of it, you know? And I've seen all these reclining nudes throughout the Renaissance, Olympia, all that stuff. I was like, man, I want to do my own version of that. Just like one day, if I had the time, I would do versions of, I would tackle Guernica if I had the time and the space. But I'm more interested in the shape canvases.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's interesting that what you're describing, it's very contextual. You know, art history may play a role if that format or whatever it is that you're working on calls for that kind of research. But if you're working on a different project.
It's great. Like the paintings I've done of the Haitian Revolution, for example. I was really upset and I needed to scream.
Yeah.
So I took the time to do a painting about the Haitian Revolution. But that's not necessarily my go-to.
Yeah.
Because that painting was finished before I started it. Sketched it out, everything. The three-dimensional work is the opposite way.
Where you don't necessarily have a plan or know where you're going to end up. Yeah. Well, LeRone, you mentioned minimalism earlier, and I wonder, how important is that art history to what you're doing? A couple of different artists maybe come to mind when I see your work, at first. And I can make a relationship to some of the minimalist artists, but I wonder if that's something that's important to you, or if you have other cultural histories that come into
I do
your
have
work.
other cultural histories, but I do have a great sense of other artists that Mel Edwards, Richard Hunt, David Smith, Martin Prio, and who was my professor. And I look at that work at that time. That's available now to see, but more culturally, that I was trying to incorporate the history of where in North Playa, where the natives of Kemet used wax to fuse the drawings there. It's still there, 6,000 years old. And learning the process of what they did and then and what I'm doing now, it made me really realize the importance of how they treasured the bees at that particular period. And the bees been on the planet 120 million years. They have sustained us in life and what they do, and I wanted to incorporate that sustainment and that history of these people that were African and that looked like me, that were making art with that material. So it just made me challenge, like, wow, if they did that then, I need to find a language and incorporate that into what I'm doing with my titles. So that triggered, I need to learn the language. I need to learn how to draw and understand the history of where this comes from. And that's very important spiritually in how I'm speaking about my work, because I'm dedicated and not being afraid to speak about who I am as a black man, as an artist, as a spiritual person in the world, to just say, look, I'm here and this is my gift my ancestors gave to me. So the cultural thing I wanted to keep focusing on was just the history of where these people were and who they are, and the information that was triggered in a different direction that really doesn't state who they were as me. And now it's like I can speak the language. And now that I can speak the language within my work, I can give the titles and the dates and give timelines of understanding who they were that kind of incorporated me to understand how I can introduce that into my work. Yeah. And that's really the importance of where I am now. Because now it's like I've been there several times, and I've triggered a sort of a cosmic way of venturing into understanding this history, that is Black history, and that they don't want to say, and that they're trying to trigger a different dynamic and narrative about. Yeah. And I don't want that to happen at all, because this is my African people. And I'm gonna translate that history into my work so it won't be forgotten, and then I'm reteaching it again, so if you don't know, now you know. You know what I mean? And that's the cultural side of where I want to stay focused about who I am and how my stars represent my ancestral sort of commitment for them giving me direction to create what I make.
Right. Oh, I see. So you're really engaged with the Kemetic peoples.
Of course.
With not only in terms of your form, right, in terms of the beeswax, in terms of what that meant.
Yes.
But also in terms of the history of who these people were, what their culture was like.
Exactly.
And you mentioned the spiritual connection as well.
Well, we all spiritual people. It's just in the light of how you look at it, because the universe kind of dictates everything. As we say, ma'at. And, you know, that spirituality is conformed in how, you know, I see in regards to how to be connected with great energy around me and give that back to people, because at that particular time, those periods worship Ma'at, which is the universe, and they were connected to that. So the things that they made, like the Merkuts, or as they say, pyramids, you know, it was an understanding that they found out from reaching that zone of vessel of where they came from, and everything that's in that particular that land represents that. So I'm just trying to connect my work with just having that energy and being connected to that spiritual sense that they had to move around and teach. Pretty much.
Well, I think that spiritual energy, you know, it's a fascinating concept that you said that you don't, not necessarily thinking about spiritualism, but, you know, I just in talking to you about your work, I think there is that a similar kind of energy in your connection to your work. And I remember reading and hearing that when you know a piece is finished when you feel like you can bow to it, right?
Yeah,
which I think is maybe
that.
not spiritual.
That's right.
I wish I never said
it's
that.
a deeply personal connection, you know.
Well, it's like raising the bar.
Well,
it's like raising the bar, and then and then when I don't bow to a piece, I know it's not finished. You know, it's like, you know, and I don't bow to all of them. I have a few paintings that I hate looking at every day. I don't know what's looking at them. But it is the truth, and I don't think it's spiritual. It's more like, you guys seen that movie on Disney, Inside Out? Like when people go in that other space that's called the zone. Anyone who creates feel like they're going the zone. And then if you spend a lot of time working on something, a long time, a piece of music, a piece of art, there's no way you're gonna feel like, oh, I did this. Mm-hmm. If you're honest with yourself, you're gonna look, holy crap, that went through me. I'm glad I was here for that. You're gonna have a certain sense of humility about you, if you're honest with yourself. Yeah. And that's what I was trying to say when I said that about it. I'm bowing to the energy that passed through me while I was making it. And thank God I took a nap while it passed through me. Yeah. And that's really what I'm bowing to. It's not the piece itself, but wow, because I was confused 2 days ago. Oh, wow, how did that come together? It's the problem-solving aspect of it that we all artists experience when we fight and we struggle with a piece and we don't give up, and then we're like, oh my God, how did that happen? If we're honest with ourselves at that moment, we'll realize that wasn't all you. It wasn't all your training. It wasn't all your art school. Something magical happened, and that's what I bow to, if it happens.
Yeah, oh, that's great. And I think that energy, I think that is shared with your audiences as well. I mean, speaking as, I'm not a maker, you know, I'm a viewer. And this is a question that I'm going to transition to the audience to be able to speak as well, because you're viewers, right? And when I look at your work, I feel very kind of honored to be part of this relationship, this triangulation between artists, between maker, and between me, as the viewer. And it just, looking at both of your work, when I first see your work, I know I shouldn't think this, but as a viewer, I can't help but have an impulse to touch it. I'm not going to. But it's that highly textured, kind of tactile quality. I really, want to get up there. I want to touch it. I want to see what it feels like.
Yeah.
And that just kind of makes me feel part of the equation. And I know, Claes, the story that you've told me before is when you've had a child into your studio, a little kid, and he immediately went over to one of your freestanding.
Yeah.
They don't need to. But his response to one of your freestanding stretched paintings was that he went up and gave it a big hug. So that response that belongs to the viewer, I think is such an important element that the energies that you're talking about translate, to me too, and to anyone who's viewing your work.
For me, it's quite contrary to because of the wax and where that it's from a bee, and you can eat honey and you can eat beeswax. It has that sense of smell and it has that sense of touch, and just seeing a hive outside. And people always ask me, this funny, will your work melt? And I'm like, you ever see a beehive melting? So but in context to what that material is, it's it has that sense of touch, it has that sense of smell and taste, and that's sort of incorporated in certain colors that I make with my work as well, because I use propolis, I use honey, I use pollen, and I use beeswax without any pigment in it. So technically, it's almost edible, but, but
maybe not with the metallic paints.
You gotta be careful because of the sense of what I'm mixing in there. If the resin is not in there,
right?
So
okay.
but it has that sense of those qualities to it, which it's great to see that I'm making art from.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Well, I hope we'll all control ourselves and not try to eat it. But I would love to turn the conversation over to the group and have questions from you.
Yes, I'd like to know what took you to Kemet instead of ancient Egypt?
Well, Kemet is ancient Egypt.
Yes, I know, but
the
concept.
The concept. Basically, the gift of the swarm of bees swarming on me when I actually had to go learn about the bees in handling the hives. And once that swarm kind of got to me, and what happened was, let me just tell you actually what happened. So I was taking the tray out, and the queen bee, we were looking for the queen bee in the tray, and it flew into my pocket, and I didn't know it. So Andrew was like, LeRone, why the swarm is coming? I'm like, I don't know. I got the tray out. What do you think they're coming? He's like, no, where's the queen? And we couldn't find the queen, so they swarmed on me. But I had a mask and everything on me. How can I say this? Man, the gift of what that bee is and how they just react, it was like a spiritual sense of them coming to me. And learning the history, how I know about the bees in Playa, because you can see these in the caves. They're 6,000 years old. And once learning that history about that, it just took me there. You know what I'm saying? I had to learn about this history in accordance of what I was doing with the bees. And once learning about it, it just transpired even more to me to understand and know the history, because they worked with and done so much with bees, and especially with Neymar and Imhotep. When he cried, when things happened to him, he cried out the bees and his tears. So reading that story, it just kind of triggered in me about learning more about Kemet and just what was going on with the bees there and how they transpired that into what their wealth was and how they looked at nature because of the bees. And I just wanted to study that and really put that in my work. So that's how it started.
Bringing the conversation back to color, from conversations with both of you, I happen to know that there's a very specific use of the color blue in both of your works, and it's for very different reasons. And I was hoping that you could both speak on that.
Well, for me, like a royal blue, ultramarine blue,
It's a very electric blue.
yeah, well, I think that's a spiritual color for me. Like, it makes me think of, I mean, when I think of heaven or the afterlife, it's not white, it's that color. That's it.
For me, it's the moon, as we call it, Ea. Ea is the color of that, and excuse me, spiritually, I just was feeling how the moon embraces us all when it's a full moon. And when I was born, I had a crescent. And at that particular time, I was just learning about how the crescent moves in certain direction now. You know, it's just part of nature. And we don't really understand this a lot, and it's so crazy. The dolphin and the sea turtle, how they work within the moon in space, and although they're in the ocean, but the stardust that comes from the cosmic understanding of Ma'at, and when it transpires down into nature, they actually create the sort of, what do you call it, the plants that look like my paintings, coral in the ocean. So that just triggers so much, you know, color that goes on, and typically it's that blue, it's a blue kind of coloring that the stardust is. And I didn't know that, so I just wanted to kind of, you know, pay attention to that. I'm like, man, I got to paint blue. Like, you know, let me put this blue into my work because it has a visual sort of connection to us. And I like looking, I'm just dead center, man, I'm looking right at that color now. So it's like, you know, I see that now, even looking at the audience, I'm paying attention to that color. So it just grabs you in a way that, you know, it speaks to me.
Can I add something too? Because I think for me, I didn't think about it till now. It reminds me of indigo, which is Haiti. It's very Caribbean color. I don't even know what the deal is with indigo. Like, you don't see a tube of paint that says indigo in it, but it's the closest color I probably can get to indigo as well, which is very Caribbean color.
Hi. Well, I want to thank you I'm learning so much, and it's so inspiring to hear about your processes. And so I was curious about something, which is that the more I looked at the work, the more I could envision it taking over the space as an installation, as a free-standing sculptural piece. And I thought a little bit about Linda Benglis's work when I looked at your surface, the luscious quality of the surface and the organic textures. And I'm dying to see Claes's unpainted structures, because I'm just trying to imagine what they look like and how they're made. Like, I still have no idea how you're constructing that drum-like surface. And you said that you have some freestanding paintings. So I guess what I'm wondering is, do you think about accumulating work to create a shrine-like space, or a space where we can be surrounded by these physical kinds of structures? And if so, how would that take the work into a different terrain? Because I know as an artist, your work is always changing. You get bored of doing the same thing, and it seems like you've had such a journey, each of you, to get to this very unique way of working. So maybe I'm projecting too much, but I'm just curious.
No, not at all.
You know, I'm just wondering, like,
No,
how do you see it changing, or what are you excited to try next in your work? Or are there things that the next mountain that you might be envisioning climbing in this work?
You want to do rock, paper, scissors?
I don't even know.
You got it.
Man, just shaking hands. I just, where I'm really dimensionally thinking is just incorporating metal in my work. And freestanding work is definite for me. But more importantly, I want to show figures of, you know, particular people and particular periods of what I study. And the challenge is to kind of incorporate that in wax and metal so it can sustain itself. And, you know, I like the two-dimensional things on the wall, but three-dimensionally, how, you know, it has relief to it. I don't ever really get bored with that because I'm still learning how to actually work with different color pigments, and I haven't used them all. And like I said, in the process of how I have to, certain pigments like pink, it's a pink pigment that can only burn at 80 degrees. So I literally have to scoop that out the pot very quickly in order to apply it because I can't build it up. And I'm really trying to master the understanding of how not to get it wrong. So when that reflects into my work and using certain colors that I haven't used yet, you know, it's always still a challenge. And I still have to keep, you know, moving forward with what my process is and where I'm taking any circle or even, because I can do that as well, but it just weighs, you know, a ton. And I'm not trying to kill anybody moving my artwork around, but, you know, I think me just incorporating metal and really my forte of how I know metals like I learned it when I learned welding when I was 12. And I haven't really gotten a chance to go back to that because of my studio being it's wood floors. So I really want to put that sculptural process in what my work represents and develop a really just a phenomenal way to show my work in a three-dimensional way with, you know, using wax. So yeah, I'm hoping I can get to that like next month or 2 months, whatever. But until I get another studio with, you know, concrete floors, then I got to stick to what I do. But it's still, you know, I make little trinkets of things and put them together to keep me focused to go back to that if I need to, you know, because it just doesn't stop with me making circles. Circles are my stars. And then I got my planet series, and, you know, there's certain things I want to do sculpturally wise and height that will be very profound in how I see the universe and that connection with me. And I haven't had a chance to create that yet, but stay tuned.
Yeah, that's a serious question. The only place I think I have an installation right now is in my studio in West Philly. And it has that effect where you get the feeling that, oh, that's got to be your uncle, that's your cousin, that's your sister. I have a few masks and a few standing statues. So in my mind, a mask or a creature that is poking its head into our dimension. And the standing statues are made the same way, three-dimensional canvas. They have simply completely stepped out. So that's the way I've envisioned them, which is why it's easier to assume that they're related and the stories are connected. So I'm into an installation. I'm into it in a very small environment, like my studio. Right now, Queen of Time is hanging out by herself, poking into our world. But I've thought about installation ever since I started this thing, because I still am a big fan of H.R. Geiger and how his drawings became the premise for Alien. And so ever since then, I've always imagined, let's just take Queen of Time. What's her story? What's the rest of her body look like? What's her world look like? What's her car or her house looks like? So it's easy to take them into installation. But just like you were saying, you need like 30-hour days and 6 studios and a whole bunch of time, because I don't know, I'm a process makers, but the idea of an installation would mean a lot more work, and I think it would include three-dimensional standing pieces to ignite the space.
I forgot to mention, I don't know why I can't never remember this, but I did a really great installation at a fair, and I made the entire room out of beeswax. So yeah, it's like, man, why can I never remember this? It was phenomenal in terms of the fair because you can walk in it and touch it and, you know, interact with it. And it was incredible, the press I got from that, and it was fabulous. So I have done one, you know what I mean? So on to the next ones.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you both very much, and thank you all for coming. And the gallery's here until 8, so we'll be hanging around. We can have personal conversations and look at the art in the space. Thank you both. Yeah.
Thanks to all of you. I want to remind you that we have 3 more conversations next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday at 6 o'clock. We're thinking about an extension in the space. We don't know for sure, but I'm going to throw that out there to tantalize your interest. And thanks again. We have some wine, we have some potato chips. So, we're looking good. So thanks again to all of these wonderful people for this great conversation. One more hand for this great panel.